being the guest and understanding everything through the guest lens is the singular most important sensation when you're looking at hospitality as a whole. How does this design make you feel? How does the lighting in this room make you feel? How does the, noise of the dishwasher in proximity to the bar make me feel? I'm constantly filtering through the sensations of feeling. How does this plate of food make me feel? How does the plate make me feel? How does the portion size make me feel? How does it always make me feel? And I feel like when you understand what you want to feel and the magnitude of that across all the little throughputs that you can gather and cluster, and there's always more, but you try to compound as many as you can. If you can express that feeling in advance of ever walking into that building to people who you want on your team, you're not picking that chef. He is actually picking you. And that's the viewpoint I take on it. I don't want to go pick somebody. I want to make sure you understand my vision so clearly that you pick me.
I mean, I've been a fan of watching your Instagram, and it's weird because we haven't seen each other probably for 12 or 15 years, but I feel like I know you and everything about what you've been up to from Instagram. I wanted to start from back in the day. We went to college together, University of Miami, and I remember the first time I saw you, I just didn't know what to think. You were driving around in a 7 Series BMW. You looked like you were there on a football scholarship combined with like a businessman, entrepreneur. Like you already looked like a restaurant guy. You already looked like a nightlife guy. And then we became friends and we lost touch. But I've been watching you build this unbelievable hospitality platform. So maybe we could start like what happened after college? Because I have no idea.
Sure. It's so funny. I've had so many varying stories about people's first view of me at Miami, and that car comes up all the time, which was a riot. But after college, I actually went with another guy that I met at Miami. I look back, it was kind of a crazy ride. I lived in his parents' basement for like a year and a half, fostering a startup company he and I started. And we were right at the time of Obama's big Green Deal, chasing tax credits that existed in the green energy and predominantly solar energy space based in New Jersey. It was a first adult version of an entrepreneurial effort. When I look back at it in context, like it probably fostered a lot of how I have approached things in life. But in reality, that business like never really took off in a material monetary way. But what it did do for me was like 7 days a week, grinding, working, trying to, make things happen when things don't even make sense to happen. That's where it birthed. I was fortunate enough as a kid to, be around parents that were in the house. We're not hospitality students, but we're in the entrepreneurial arena. And so like working hard and seeing that grind was not something I was unfamiliar with. But this was my first, like, let's go for it out of college exercise. And, it really just fostered my ability to kind of get to where I started, which is effectively formed where I am today, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about.
People don't get into the hospitality business to get insanely rich. I think they do it because they love it and they love entertaining people and being around people. What did you learn when you were doing your first entrepreneurial venture about following what you love and what inspires you and what gives you energy?
Yeah, it was interesting. The family that I lived with, the father was in the restaurant business. And so, I'm living in his house for 2 years, grinding with his son on a business that, we thought there was a lot of, rainbows, sunshines, and gold buckets on the end of those rainbows. What I came to realize was my purpose for the business was without purpose. And, I'm 22, 23 years old, thinking like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do, which is make money. But there was no like love for it. The only thing I really loved was I loved the grind. I didn't necessarily love the space, the arena, even the conversations. What I learned in that moment was like how I had to foster a sensation of knowing what the hell I was talking about and, becoming, excellent in that. But, I think what really pivoted for me was the realization that like the human interactions that I enjoyed in life were not present. They were very transactional in that arena, right? It was like a contract focused business deal. And there was no human interaction for us outside of the sale, if you will. And I'm not a salesman. Like that's just not who I am as a human being. Like I don't want to sell anything. I'm like, this is the where I'm going. If you want to come with me, come with me. If you don't, like that's okay. I'm not a sales guy. And I learned that in that exercise. So what I needed to do is I needed to create things that people could experience at their own, discerning choice or at speeds in which they wanted to enjoy it. More of a I build it, they'll come a little bit mentality. And that's what eventually, made it obvious for me. Uniquely enough, my family's in, your business. My brother's in the real estate business. My dad and mom are in the real estate business. So growing up around the real estate business, you're creating place and you're creating home and you're creating sensations that, are really meaningful to people that are more than the transaction. And restaurants and in particular hospitality, because it's really what we'll get into it, but like what I think I sell or create is not food and is not beverage. Like those are obligatory things that are required in the arena, but I'm here to sell an experience and feelings. And hopefully through experience and feelings, I foster what I think is most important on life, which is relationships. And I think that's what's helped me grow in this market is that people want to do transactions and deals with us because they want the relationship fostering that, really guides the light for what I'm, trying to accomplish.
Where did the grind come from?
It's a good question. I think everyone has it, and whether or not they want to talk about it. But I was always, I'll take you back a little bit. My dad's first generation American. He was born in Israel. My mom was born here in the States. My dad didn't come from much. He came to this country with $400, and he really just wanted to make it. And as he made it, as he explored making it and tried to cultivate it his whole, professional career, and as he aged in life, a lot of what I think I gathered as a kid was all the feelings that I saw my dad put into his work, some really, fruitful and beneficial, obviously, and some less, some less great that I, probably held on to more than even the good ones and wanted to, I wanted to be as good or better than my parents, as professionals, as human beings. Like I think they raised us to want to outperform them. And I took that really seriously. Even though I chose to go in a different arena, a lot of that choice for me was that I felt like my parents raised me to drive the car, not be a passenger in it. And I have parents, in particular my dad, he's the kind of guy that will never let go of the steering wheel. And I don't blame him. That's how he got to where he got. But there's no room for two of us in the same vehicle. And so I took a different vehicle. And, honestly, today, looking back, like definitely my biggest critic, but certainly my biggest fan. And I think that's been fostered by the fact that like, I don't have to come to the dinner table and talk about the same transaction that we are working on, throughout the course of the day. I want to hear about his stuff. He wants to hear about my stuff. And sometimes, yeah, it's one big family, but it's not the same stuff.
A few years ago, I realized like one of the only things I had in common with my dad was business, and that all we would talk about is business. So hearing you, and we've worked on it, and now it's a lot better, but hearing you describe that is, really fascinating, because I think a lot of people feel pressure to go into a family business, and it's even more difficult when the child knows that the parent's not really going to give over the reins.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is like, my style. I'm in a heavy centric business. My dad he would love to like move himself further and further and further away from the managerial style that he really only knows how. And the fact of the matter is, like his greatest gift wasn't people management. His greatest gift was his drive. And so I got to watch, I got a front row seat. You got a front row seat to your parents. I had a front row seat to watch how my parents do what they do. And, I'm not critical of it in a negative fashion. I'm just like, well, what can I take from this that maybe lets me do it better, do it different, make it successful for me? And I think that was really the impetus was like, I just knew I had a different style. I had a, very type A, aggressive family operational business that I knew when I got involved in it, even in an earlier stage of my life, my style wasn't the style of that song and dance. And unless that style of business, approach culture was going to change, I was okay letting that go down one street if I was just going to go down another. And I knew time was like not going to sit here and be my friend. I'll say this, publicly. My dad has said to me, the day you're going to get involved in my business is the day I die. And I look at him and I'm like, that's not my choice. That's your choice. And he looks at it like, no, it's your choice. And for me, it's like, it's not a bad choice. It's just, if you're happy doing what you're doing, and I don't want to disrupt your happiness. And if I'm happy with what I'm doing, you know, there's only so much time and bandwidth. And if that becomes reality, then guess what? I'll make sure that it's in good hands if that, day shows up. But in the meantime, I'm still loving what I'm doing and you're loving what you're doing.
Did your desire to figure out how to manage people, was that partly to become bigger and do things differently than your dad? Because like, did you feel in a way that maybe your dad was held back by his struggle with management and oversight?
I think everybody, like, at one point or another, things change, life changes. You get to a point where, like, you might even gotten bigger, but that doesn't necessarily make you better than you maybe were. Or like when you had, I'm making this number up, but when you were operating 5 businesses versus 10, you were a better operator of 5. And the changes from 5 to 10 are not you as the same operator. It's like, well, what do you have to become to let the business have great operations at, let's say, 10 versus 5? And I think for my dad, like, I just think for him, and I don't know this for sure because I don't necessarily know if the answer I'm getting is a little more compounded or not, but I would imagine he was happy at a certain level of how it ran and at the cadence it ran and what it provided. And, a lot of, sometimes more doesn't mean more in some respects. And so you hit a certain plateau. And when you're 15 or 18 or 20 years old, you look at that and think the world's way bigger. I'm like, oh, you didn't go to college. I went. What am I supposed to do with all this time that you spent for me to go somewhere, just to hold it at the status quo? But then what you realize is, like, you're basically asking your parents to take a risk that they have calculated out of their equation. You and I are sitting here at the beginning stages. There's so much more green grass in front of us. And there's 2 different horses. There's ones that ran the race a long time ago and that don't need to run it as hard today. And there's younger horses that want to run it. And I think that's the magic of how I'm trying to view it, is like, not so hard how hard I can run, but can I set the stage that I'm able to bring into this organization a litany of more horses in the future, whether they're my kids or they're other kids or other young professionals that want to run and chase, because that's what the beauty of young, aggressive people are, is that, like, they just see that there's so much more in front of them. I think for my parents, and I think it's just human nature, everyone gets comfortable at some point and doesn't need to take on the risk associated with things they don't love. And for my parents, I think, or my dad in particular, I think that was more the human capital management side of the business.
I like to think that we went to University of Miami at like the peak time, the best time. And it's probably better now, and everyone thinks that. But when we were in Miami, Miami was amazing in terms of South Beach, what they had from a nightlife experience, what they had from an amenity experience. And it didn't have the explosive growth that it's had over the past 4 or 5 years with COVID and all that stuff. What, looking back on it now, did going to college in a place like that end up doing and having an impact on your career choice and how you view restaurants and nightlife and hospitality?
Yeah, totally. And you mentioned this earlier, but like, my original college choice was Michigan State University to play football. And then shortly after being there my freshman year, I said, you know what, football is not going to be my life's decision. I need to get out away from football and I need to go where I'm going to see the world, be with individuals who come from different walks of life, much more internationally exposed and very hyper nationally exposed, also a bit more intimate. And so obviously Miami checked a lot of those boxes for me. I would say on top of that, what Miami fostered, and I'm in concurrence when you say, like, maybe we were there at, like, right at the inception of Miami's beauty from an international's perspective of, like, what Miami is today. we were there right before like that first recessionary, crunch. And so there was like just glow all over the place. And I look back and I would say like what I took from there is what like I think everyone aspires from travel. Like you were able to have traveled to one place, but been in so many at the same time. And I feel like when you look across the country, there's just not a lot of places that reference that. I mean, you could argue New York City brings you a dose of that. You could argue a couple other metropolitan markets can give you it, but we were able to have friends from so many different walks of life, people who had different cultural backgrounds. It was a very interesting melting pot. I think the biggest capture I took away is like growing up in Michigan, I don't think I ate outdoors outside of like, sleepaway camp and like the occasional backyard barbecue. And then moved to Miami and I'm like, I don't think I ate indoors for years straight. So like I started to understand the experience of dining, the experience of being a guest, the relationship of service. I think that was the other factor. I think a lot of people confuse those two realities between service and hospitality a lot in my arena. But like I started to experience service where coming from a market where there was maybe like lots of humble Midwestern roots, there wasn't necessarily an intention to service. And then that fostered hospitality and it fostered VIPing and it fostered, getting to know and the relationship factors that maybe, were not required previously in my market.
What happened from the first business next?
Yeah. So I came out of college. I joined my parents for probably 3 to 6 months. I looked at them and I'm like, I got to get out of here. This just isn't my calling. It was also a unique time as, I don't know if you remember, but this was the end of '07, beginning of '08. And I could smell the writing on the wall in Michigan already. My dad, who's been around, many cycles, was like, yep, this is definitely not our buying period. So I come out of college wanting to buy the world and develop the world and build cities and buildings or create value. And my parents are looking at me like I've lost my mind. I'm thinking, I just came from Miami. Like, am I going to hunker down here? So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, there was this, shift in politics and shift in conversations and energy. I went and did this, nearly 2 years of chasing that. And for me, the reality was, which I mentioned earlier, there just wasn't a lot of purpose for me in that. And so the first restaurant, which is unique to me, it's, it's still around. I view my restaurants like children. It's like a firstborn child, and how much they teach you about being a parent is no different than, what a first business is like about teaching you about your business. That I really knew nothing about restaurants outside of being the guest. And I think that's always fostered for me how I approach a restaurant and how, more importantly, how I foster what I think others will. Part of me just thinks of myself as like the most neurotically obsessed guest on the planet. And I'm like, if I can make myself happy in this place, I can make the market happy in this place. And knock on wood, so far that's been the case. But first one was a tiny little space that was never designed to be a restaurant. I actually bought it with my brother in 2009. Yeah, end of 2009, beginning of 2010 from the bank. It was a tiny little nothing. I called the bank and I was like, it was Comerica Bank. And I'm like, this thing's for sale, right? And they're like, have you ever been there? And I'm like, no, but the windows are all boarded up. I'm like, but come show it to me. I walk in there and it's 2 separate little retail spaces that aren't even contiguous. And they're, I don't know, 350 square feet a piece. And I'm looking around the place and I'm like, there's this other little land over here. And they're like, yeah, it's part of the association. Maybe they'll let you have it and do something with it. So before I closed, I went to the association and asked, hey, you guys want these to be active? I'll put a restaurant here. They didn't even ask me what restaurant experience I have, which was kind of the craziest part. And they're like, yeah, we'll agree to let you expand this like 600 square feet. So needless to say, I expand this, I get their approval, and then I go buy it. And I buy it from the bank on foreclosure. It was a very cheap transaction. And I went to all the restaurant people I knew in the market. It was like, hey, do you want to open a restaurant here? And they all thought I was nuts. They're like, this is not a restaurant. It was never supposed to be a restaurant. And they weren't wrong. It was never supposed to be one. And, I think that's the beauty of knowing nothing. Like there is something amazing. And I sometimes always try to like be my 24-year-old self. I can again, if I can, because all this stuff we learned along the way fosters these like preconceived feelings and thoughts we have. And it causes us to lose sometimes creativity or imagination that, my 24-year-old self who was just trying to make it and make sense and start somewhere. So I take this deal, I pitched to the city, they give me an approval for a special liquor license and birthed my first restaurant, which was Townhouse, which uniquely goes back to your earlier question, like where did the concept come from in a way? And it was like, because I lived in New Jersey and I was in my friend's basement and I was adamant about trying to figure out how to enjoy New York while I was here, any moment I could go to the city to like find a place to eat, I would do it. And so I would, venture all over the place. And as I discovered Minetta Tavern's Black Label Burger, I was like, okay, this place burger is just too good. There was nowhere else I was finding such an experience, but yet I didn't necessarily love the enclave of it for myself because like the experience I had eating outside for 3 years, 4 years in Miami, I took those two sentiments and just embarked them in together and created this like Parisian cafe culture, which in many ways kind of feels more like a pastis in form than I would say like less like a Minetta or even a Balthazar. It's not Parisian as a whole, it's more Americana, but the idea that somebody could take so much effort to do something so classic like a burger and shape your mind about something you've been eating, mom and grandma's and everyone else's version of over the years, fostered the first restaurant. And so I opened that in 2011. I was 25 in 2011, and that's kind of where it all started. And in that moment, it was like, okay, what do I know about the restaurant business? And I didn't know really shit. Looking back, I remember opening night and the chef was like, unfortunately, we're 86 burgers. And I look at him like, what is 86? I don't even know what that means. I was like, I don't even know what that even means. And I'm like, it just goes to show like, you don't have to know it all. You just have to want to have it all, and for me, I wanted to be successful. I wanted to prove to myself that, all this hard work would pay off in some fashion. And, I was head down trying to learn the business daily at that moment. And, in hindsight, I'm happy it started in a place like that. I always said, I don't know, as a child, I'd always tell my parents, like, man, look at this amazing thing. And, the humility of my dad always reminded me that things are built brick by brick. And Rome, effectively the old adage that it wasn't built in a day. And I'm like, there's no restaurant empire that just started at 100. Everybody starts somewhere. That was my somewhere. And I think the biggest piece, and I'll leverage this, I think it's a good response, even in lieu of a question. I think the biggest opportunity at 24 was like, you go to college, you chase education. I think fortunately for me, I wasn't like, I never was overly obsessed or intrigued or hyper interested in what everyone else was doing. And I think there's sometimes in today's day and age that's certainly abundant. But like, if you had asked me, was I ever going to be in the restaurant business as a child, I would have laughed because I remember what it was like as a kid growing up. My parents worked a lot, so we ate out a lot. And I saw the chef in the dining room or the guy who was there and his wife was vacuuming and the kids were cooking in the back. And it was, that was the day and age of my 1980s, early 90s, restaurant experience. And I never thought I'd be in that realm or even narrative whatsoever. Even though I didn't put myself there exactly, the humility that was required of going in and, getting your ass kicked for months in this business, trying to figure it out, just, went to show what it actually, took to start. And I think starting is the part that, fascinates me the most sometimes with people.
Is there a story or two that encapsulates what it was like setting up that first restaurant versus how you've evolved now to setting up a restaurant and what's changed?
I mean, crazy how much has changed. I would say, just to give you a point of reference, the first chef and general manager who took the job with me at that moment, I didn't think they were batshit crazy. But then I look back over the years and I would chuckle to say, what was wrong with those two people who took the job to go start a restaurant with someone who knew absolutely not, they didn't even know if I could pay for it. I mean, they didn't have a clue about anything. And yet they took it and they took that and ran with it. And I think a lot of it goes back to the power of vision and the power of having communicative dream that people who generally don't necessarily, because I think the majority of people don't have that sensation, how infectious vision and dream can be to get people on the boat and paddle in that direction. So I look back, like that was stage one, day zero. I was mapping out on the floor with concrete blue tape saying, this is where this is going to go. And this is where this is going to go. And, like everything was as rudimentary, or I don't even want to say budget, because like I didn't even think I had a budget. I was just trying to like figure it out without spending any money at the same time. And like today, the difference for me, probably most profound, is like how many people rely on the planning. The vision is obvious, like they're all relying on the vision, but how many more people are relying on the planning? And you have one employee, no employees, 10 employees. It's like I can be the voice box. Everyone can hear me at the same time. Today, with 500 plus employees, like how many people can actually hear what I'm saying, and do they get it, and how I have to broadcast that vision in the most important planning way. And to be honest, being like hypervision centric and like creatively focused, it's not easy for me to like document in the most, what I would say, educationally structured way. I have to surround myself with a lot of people who solve that problem for me. Well, today that is more important sometimes than even the vision, because I'm relying on people to do parts of the exercise that I used to have to do. We're wearing 12 hats. Now I wear maybe one or two or three hats, but all the other hats that are being worn by others are relying on the structure and the organizational systems and the planning. It's like my first set of construction drawings versus the drawings I do today. I mean, it was a napkin. It was a point and build, like, hey, put that over there, and like, no, move that light fixture over 6 inches, it looks better over there. Now it's like, big firms doing big things with lots of accountability, and contracts are a lot longer. I don't even think I had a contract for the construction on the first project. So in general, I would say, yeah, planning, how the vision's broadcasted, those have changed a ton. And I just, the resource requirements are different. First restaurant I opened was 400 grand. The next one I'm going to open is 6 million. Like, that's just a very different resource requirement, because also how I view those restaurants is I was building a $400,000 restaurant to hopefully do $1.5 million then. Okay. We did a $400,000 restaurant that did $3 million. I was like, okay, I understand there's a different conversation in execution. If I'm going to do a $6 million restaurant there, when I look under the hood of that 6 million, $1.5 million of it is in inventory and pre-opening expenses, not even soft costs, that I never had on the books. There was no corporate overhead. I'm opening, I'm fast forwarding, but I'm opening in Nashville in November, and yep. And I got to have $500,000 just for mobility of team members to come train in that market and then house them and do all these other things. So, the machines shape differently. And, I think if I looked at all that stuff like I used to, I would never do any of it. I have to shift my understanding. And does that mean it makes all the time the same financial sense? It makes different financial sense, is probably the reality behind it.
What do you think
Not
the
as
biggest
obvious.
mistake was in the first restaurant that you kind of have a mental note to never make again, or your biggest learning that you're always going to do it differently going forward because of that?
I mean, I think for me, it's like, if you ever decide to not trust your gut as a visionary, you're pretty much failing yourself, because the whole thing is a premise of how you see your project. And if you aren't maybe completely manifesting that in its totality, you start to listen to others or hear some things that maybe you don't need to hear, and it quickly turns into the vision's a little more blurry than less clear. So that's probably one piece. I would say another one, just in context, is like, I'm in the people business, both in people who enjoy our venues, but people who run our venues. And if I think I have a chicken when I'm trying to foster a flock of eagles, get rid of that chicken quickly. They don't fly together. Chicken and eagles, they just don't fly together. And so, sometimes just the willingness to realize that that's short-term pain for long-term gain, that's probably the biggest for me. Like, the people are everything in my business.
So Jeff Klein is this hotelier from LA. He owns the Sunset Tower. hotel is one of them, and then he owns a private club. But in the Sunset Tower, they have this iconic restaurant. All these celebrities go there. And I was meeting with him when I was doing a restaurant in a hotel, and we were concepting it ourselves. And he's like, Jake, you know what you like to eat. You know what this thing should be. Do it and don't listen to anyone else. Don't listen to any chef on what you need to have on the menu. You create the menu. That's what I do. It seems like you have a similar process. Can you talk about that a little bit more and how you create the menus versus maybe just hiring some celebrity chef guy and you design the restaurant and he comes up with the menu?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of a lot of what Jeff is suggesting to you, but doing it in a way that inspires the talent. And so, the best chefs are creative. They're not operational. And like, if just accept that in part of the way that the song, dances. And I think for me, a biggest piece is like, I would never do a project I wouldn't go enjoy. And I'm making this up, but like if I did not like or want to eat ramen, you couldn't pay me to open a ramen bar.
Yeah.
It's just
Right.
not possible. I would never bring any value to that conversation. And I'm not the greatest critic of that product. And I'm not in love with it. So I don't want to own it, and I don't even want to eat at it if that's the case. So I think part of it for me is like, I have this comprehension of the kind of restaurants I feel are missing in my market or missing on this planet or missing in a setting, or a lot of it's environmental, and I'm like, okay, this is where I'd want to be. And I try to ask myself, more importantly, just because I love it doesn't necessarily mean the target market's big enough either, because like I do also love 15 courses Michelin 3-star, and there's a market for that, and it's not my backyard here in Michigan. So I'm also cognitive of that. But I would say that being the guest and understanding everything through the guest lens is the singular most important sensation when you're looking at hospitality as a whole. How does this design make you feel? How does the lighting in this room make you feel? How does the noise of the dishwasher and proximity to the bar make me feel? I'm constantly filtering through the sensations of feeling. How does this plate of food make me feel? How does the plate make me feel? How does the portion size make me feel? How does it always make me feel? And I feel like when you understand what you want to feel and the magnitude of that across all the little throughputs that you can gather and cluster, and there's always more, but you try to compound as many as you can. If you can express that feeling in advance of ever walking into that building to people who you want on your team, you're not picking that chef. He is actually picking you. And that's the viewpoint I take on it. I don't want to go pick somebody. I want to make sure you understand my vision so clearly that you pick me. And when you pick me, it's not like I got to sit there and like figure out whether or not you and I speak the same language. You have chosen to speak the language that I'm laying out is the language of this space. And it just makes it a lot easier because like, remember the conversation on the vision, remember that identity board that I put together, remember that immersive conversation that we had about X, Y, and Z. That dictates where the boat's going. How we get there doesn't always have to be as clear, but where we're going has to be black and white. And I think that for me, that's always been my best scenario. When I feel like I'm out trying to pick the chef, I always pick wrong. When they're picking me, I more than likely pick right. And it's always their pick, right? Like at the end of the day, I can't fire myself and quit this engagement. Like they're choosing to, join this project and this team. And when they really know why they signed up for it or what it was intended to become, it's not hard to kind of align those two things. When it's gray or it's a little, well, it's Italian. Well, what kind of Italian? And it's this guy, your mom's Italian, or like, if you let that crypticness kind of live in the project, you will get an unclear result. And so I think the magic is like how clear your vision and imagination is documented. And then I got to be working on that Northern Italian restaurant you're working on because I love, X, Y, and Z from the brand. And I understand that 60% female target market and it's dinner centric and it's $120 check average and it's X, Y, and Z, and here's some other brand inspirations that relate. Let's go eat at those brand inspirations. And you walk into those restaurants, you're like, that's not me, or I couldn't see us doing better. Why are you picking me? You know what I mean? Like it's your job to sign the job acceptance, but I don't want to even offer it to you until you say I got to have that job. And I think that's the way that I normally romance that situation.
Let's double click on that a little bit more. So take a restaurant, you could pick one that you have or that you're thinking about. Walk me through that like creative and vision process and kind of maybe at each stage of the process, like who you're using to make sure that vision is clearly articulated and everyone is on the same page about everything. But definitely like how does it even start?
Yeah, so like I'll use prime and proper as an example because I'm currently going through what I would say is, and I think that's the piece, and I'll touch on this, but like the brand vision never stops. Just because you paid an agency or did it internal to create a brand identity, that brand identity is, I view, no different than you and I. Like who you were 20 years ago has evolved, and it has to evolve in a material way because when it doesn't, it's like, well, it's full renovation time. Well, it didn't need to be. It's like, no, you keep tightening the screws and identifying clearly the vision. So, before you know it, it's not like, oh, we need to be an Asian restaurant. Like, no, if you love some Asian influence, allow that to show up in a dish. So I'll talk to you about how it comes from me. A lot of it is real estate centric initially. Like to me, a brand is born more often than not between two characteristics. One, I'm in love with an experience in my head that I can't get anywhere. Like, man, I just need a way better steak, or there isn't a steak that I'm in love with within the proximity. Because look, hospitality is very localized. Like, it's not like what's happening in Miami means anything to what's happening in, Troy, Michigan. Like, they're just night and day reality. So I'm in my market, I'm in Detroit, I'm downtown. I'm like, the steak market is so flat. Where does this concept in my head evolve? It's constantly being, it's blooming. And then a lot of that correlates to real estate. So then I walk into a facility or a building and I'm like, this is where my idea could be born. And there's an equal track where like the energy and excitement of that idea feels energetic and excited in the physical space itself. And so from that moment, it's really at then understanding how I document the vision side. So either I'll do this either internally or externally, and I'll work with an agency or I'll do it internally with the marketing team, just depending on where I think the project's bandwidth requires and how much internal bandwidth we have. And I will go and do a full scrub on concept. So I'm laying out and I'm like, candidly diarying of the mouth to a agency on the other end who is not missing anything. All these ideas that I have. And by the way, some may make no sense whatsoever, but I don't know they don't make sense until I start clustering them. And then I'll pull all the keywords out of that exercise. And we'll start to look at, okay, what is the tone and energy of this concept? And then, by the way, it's not like I know what it's going to look like yet, but I have these ideas of things I like and how it should feel and what it means to be the guest in that room. And, who I don't want to be is probably the biggest characteristic that I often look at. I'm like, I don't want grandma's steakhouse. I don't want grandpa's old leather couch. I don't want also supports inevitably what I do want. Or if not sure what I do want, at least it tells me which way I have to start looking. And I'll put that exercise that's normally probably 4 weeks of like real immersive thought back and forth, multiple, probably 5 or 6 conversations to get to a first inception. By the way, this has no name of a project yet. It's not like I've named it. More often than not, I don't even know what it's called yet in this exercise. I just know it's like Space Holder Steakhouse or.
So you're doing this with like a vision agency or something. It's not a design agency. It's not a branding. It's like a concept or a creative agency.
So I will use the agency that will help me form this as a preemptive service that maybe they don't offer others, but I demand it to be like, I need you to be my think tank capsule. You've worked on a lot of great things. You can help me structure it. Now, once I've done it, I've done these before. It's not like I know what the framework looks like and I know what I want to get out of this exercise, which is all the keywords that mean something to me after I've exhausted my feelings and thoughts about this space. The next layer of that is sometimes, and I don't say all the time, but sometimes I'll do a massive deep dive market study on what exists in the market. So I'm working on a Northern Italian restaurant right now for an upcoming project, and I've probably market researched 80 restaurants around the globe. And they'll do a full 1-page, maybe 2-page synopsis, like what's the notions of their menu, what's the energy of their restaurant, what's the tone and voice of their marketing mission. So like I can understand what is happening in the world of great. Are there any commonalities and consistent threads I can see that maybe exist between those brands? Maybe there's nothing, to be quite honest. This happened as well. But I use that to just also spark my attention for where I think I need to be on the bar level. It's not that I want to be said restaurant. Like I'll never market and be like, oh, I want to be like so-and-so restaurant or so-and-so restaurant. I just look at it like, okay, these are restaurants that I think speak to the same guest target I'm interested in. And if Jake enjoys that kind of restaurant, what is it about Jake's restaurant that I want to extrapolate out to make sure it lives in my restaurant? Because I know like that restaurant is in Miami and you're not going to come eat here in Michigan because you live in Florida. But if you were in Michigan, this is where you'd want to go. And so I'm looking for that at the same time. And then that leads to inevitably the next round of what I would say is the branding conversations. Like, okay, I think I know who the market is, and I feel like I know what's in our market, and I know the things that emotionally drove me to like why I wanted steak and why I picked this location. And then for me, next is really getting into like brand mark, brand identity, brand tone conversation. I mean, I think the prime and proper brand deck's like 130 pages today. Like it's exhausted. And I do that because to me, I don't want anyone in our company to not know every possible thing about how this brand wants to talk, how we are involved in social, what's our photography style, how do we do video, how we don't do video, the ways we use our marks, the ways we don't, what you would expect to find at a high retail or high hotel experiential space, I don't think should exist any differently. And then, it's really the inevitability of the rollout of taking that. I'll never go to an interior design firm until that whole exercise I just explained to you has been done. Absolute waste of time. Now, what I do to the interior design firm is I'm like, if you give me my interior design based upon this brand, you also have failed me, because just because this is the way that I talk doesn't mean it's the way that I want to dress. Right? You can have okay, just because somebody looks a particular way doesn't mean they act a particular way. And just because they have a certain approach to the way they choose to speak with you doesn't necessarily mean their values are directly correlated and how they might conversate. So I'll give you an example, the old expression, business in the front, party in the back. That's two human beings. It's one human being with two realities. Well, the most interesting brands to me have a very three-dimensional, multifaceted personality. Like the most intriguing humans, the most interesting arts, the most unique music isn't black and white, and it's not one straight line. So if I give you a brand deck and like, oh, your colors are black, white, gold, whatever, don't give me back an interior design that is just black, white, and gold. Like that's what AI would give me. What you need to give me is like, tell me how this brand wants to act and speak beyond just how it might look and how those things, evolutionize themselves. But I want I want the interior design agency in the architectural realm to know the clarity of tone, voice, keyword, all of those things are defined. It's their job to like squeeze the last little water out of the towel now versus just hold the bag of 100-page brand guideline. And I think that's where the best projects really come to life, is the interior design. It's like pushing you into uncomfortable realms, and you have to decide like, nope, that's off the ledge or that's right on the line. And right on the line to me is like where interesting lives, because the personality of the design is more interesting than just the look of the brand. And I think that's the balancing act, because a lot of brands look really clean, but there's just no personality behind them. And I think you see that a lot today. I mean, a perfect example is like why so many retail brands are forging roads into hospitality. They need to relate back to the sensory feeling of guest on the emotional side, while they also need to be part of the transaction-oriented side, because not everyone can afford a new Birkin every week, but I need to, be in the minds and hearts and sensations. But how much more interesting is that brand when it does more than just sell leather goods? how much more interesting is that restaurant when it does more than just sell steaks? And that's how I view even us. Like, we have a membership model to our steak knife. We're doing invitation experience to our most loyal guests and community shape makers. We invite you to have your own knife. And that knife is exclusively yours in that restaurant, and it's on display. It's the wine at the front door that you pay to put in a box that you never paid to put in a box. And it's something that's yours, and it's an emotional piece. But nobody owns that knife or wants to have that knife and not share the sensations of owning that knife with other people. So what happens is that guest doesn't eat by themselves. They always bring somebody else to foster the here's my knife moment with them. And then it, enriches the personality. But to go back to what I was saying, I just think the brand has to be clear, the process of how you get to that brand. When I looked in the earliest stages of my career, I didn't have a fraction of those resources. I just kind of knew what I wanted. And I was like, okay, draw me this, make it look like that. No, change the color. It should look like that. And over time, I put a lot more early anticipation on thinking about it to try to make sure it was something that I loved for the long term, not just liked for the moment. Oh, I like that color. Let's do it right now. And then I'm like, well, did I really like that color for a being on that brand, or did I like that color because that color is warm and fuzzy in the moment? And then 6 months, 6 years later, I'm like, I don't really care for that color. The why, I would say, behind every decision being more clear than less.
And you didn't even get to, at this point, we've designed the restaurant. When do we even start talking about the menu and the food component and the service?
Yeah. So I think once, I go back to that conversation on the chef. It's like, I don't want that chef to walk in and get any less than the interior design firm got. And to tell you the truth, they get more than the interior design firm, because the design is, 80% of the way cooked up. I also do, and this is just maybe my style. I'm not saying it's the perfect style, but like, we'll start exploring kitchens and kitchen design even before I even have the chef. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, like, internally at the organizational level, like, we're pretty confident that we know how to run kitchens today, and that 80% is there and 20% is left for insight, innovation, adaptation, or whatever. Because I also have to build it to a budget and not be stuck with the chef who wanted to build me the Taj Mahal, and then I got no chef and the Taj Mahal. So I'm also, aware of that. But I would say that once you have the identity of your brand clear, it's so much easier to foster whether or not somebody wants to be part of it. Like, you see exactly what's coming. Like, you have a really clear sensation. Doesn't mean I won't take feedback or I love your amazing idea, because clearly, like, my restaurants are not built on my ideas alone. But, can you do it in this arrangement to understand that I'm pretty confident the target market fit is there and that this product's what the market wants? You just have to make it, go from very good to great. But the chef side is, that process, the service side of those things are, I think when I look back, a lot of that brand was fostered like in my office. So, when I think of a restaurant, I don't just think of like what food I want to eat. I'm like, how do I want to feel? How do I want to feel? Well, what kind of service makes me feel a particular way for this brand? How is that compartmentalized, encapsulated? So, like, that restaurant in particular has 2 servers. I split the 2 servers up. One is 100% focused on beverage all night. The other one is 100% focused on food. I don't like the lull between my food and my drinks not having perpetuating, but I also love, and I don't want the guests to feel like I got the server hovering all night, the same question, the same thing. So I let somebody come to the table and say, I'm in charge of all things beverage tonight. And the next server who comes and presents menus after your drink order is like, I'm yours all night and I'm on food. And now I have 2 servers on that table. And before you know it, there's a back waiter who does all the clearing and all the bussing and the hot towel service and the bread service. And under the hood, people don't see this, but under the hood, there's 1 server per table. They have a 3-table section with 3 people working it. The service ratio that comes out of spending a lot of money on delicious steaks and food should be, man, food's amazing, but damn, the service is spectacular. You can't have great hospitality without great service. So like the idea for me was like people drive the boat. I wanted that part. So I curated, what does that service look like? Like, hey, we're going to set up a table in the restaurant and we are going to play server and we're going to walk you through what it looks like to go through service and talk about timing and talk about placement. And does this feel right? Does this feel wrong? Oh, shoot, we're doing chilled appetizer, raw food service course where there's, crustaceans and oysters. Great, happy we're doing hot towel service at the end, but no, we need to also introduce hot towel service right here. And so you walk through those exercises for the months leading up to getting to construction being complete. And obviously now that's the beauty in which I don't think people recognize it as clearly, but it takes 1/10 the amount of effort to open the second of the same concept as it does to open a brand new concept. So prime and proper Nashville, I don't need to decide what plates I serve on. I don't need to pick the silverware for that restaurant. I know exactly what linen we spec'd for that brand. I know exactly what the uniform looks like for the server staff. I know exactly what cooking equipment we cook on in comparison to executing that menu. So 90% of the hardest decisions of that brand that are fostered as the first time you make a decision about that brand is gone. That's why, like, my operating partner in the business is a 16-year Hillstone guy. And, I'd like, when we dialed up, like, why is Hillstone so great? It's because they don't recreate a new brand. And every person who's at that company is constantly tightening the screw on the same exact thing day in and day out. It's not hard to be great when you totally are focused on one thing. I compare it to sports. Imagine being a pro in 6 different professional sports. Inevitably, you're not going to be a pro in probably 5 of them, yet you're out fostering new brands all the time. So like maybe the brand is different, but all the processes have to be identical. Otherwise, there is no possibility that you could be great at that brand. So like behind the scenes at Prime and Proper, making salad dressing is the exact same fundamental approach to making salad dressing at Mad Nice or Townhouse. Like how the ingredients are different, the expectations of the results are the same, but how we build that recipe and what it looks like in the same tracking document and the same word choice and everything is down to grams and how you scale and where there's photographs in the process. I could bring you from restaurant to restaurant. You could open up that document and be like, okay, I understand that's the English of Heirloom hospitality to make a salad dressing. So behind the scenes, the processes are critical, but I think when you get into trying to select those things, those are things I didn't necessarily learn until a little later on in this, song and dance.
But the hardest part is accountability and the people component, because that's different from Prime and Proper Nashville to Prime and Proper Detroit. Like the same people don't work in each place. So how do you A, hold people accountable when you're not there? And B, how are you going to train and find and hire the same caliber and quality of folks? So like when you go to a Hillstone, it is like the same thing. You don't even know what city you're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me today, and this has been in the company for more than a decade, but I am hiring to core values and I am training to skill sets. So if you are a core value fit, which we have 5 clear core values, some of those take maybe a little more time than others sometimes to really discern. But I think I have a pretty candid accountability structure, which is you can work in this company if you're for sure a 4 out of 5 core value fit, but you just can't be a negative on the 5th one. It has to be a plus minus. So like that is our defined standard. Consistently care about the smallest details. Every second counts. Willingness to learn and teach is an example of 3 of them for the moment. If I understand that we have human beings in the company that are all help, I don't care if you're me holding my direct reports accountable to that, or you're the GM of a restaurant holding your AGMs or staff in that restaurant accountable to those 5 core values, to that same standard line. I know I'm doing the most I can to initiate the Eagles and chickens analogy. From that is like, well, how clear is the context? And do I have the layers in place? Plus, what is my degree of investment to the people in the process, not just the place and the product? I can build a beautiful place. Great. But that doesn't solve the problem. How much effort am I putting into recruitment? How much effort are we putting into people selection? How much effort are we putting into training? Training is expensive. I mean, it's probably to open a restaurant with great training, it's $250,000 today to open a full service, great restaurant for 2.5 weeks of great training, paying the tab with no revenue. So is that in your budget? And if it's not, are you willing to take the heartburn in the medium to short term to possibly get to the long term? I'm not willing to gamble on that. And so it's on top of that. So not only are we willing to train the staff for 2.5 weeks before we open, how many people, for example, are moving from Michigan to Nashville, either temporarily or permanently, to support that opening? So we have several going permanently, and we have probably 10 or 12 who will go for about a month. Then staff those team members in your previous store to make sure those holes are filled. Is the reality that human capital is the business. And I want to say this, you said this earlier, it's just, it couldn't be more true. The best restaurants on the planet are unfortunately the ones that make the least amount of money. Because what makes them great is their contribution to what's required that all surfaces between what I would say gross profit and net profit. Like, there's a lot of great restaurants buying good product, and there's a lot of people paying top tier for whatever talent. But all the things you don't see add up, compounding, steer the boat. And you look at Hillstone, they're a low profit business. But they're a high rev business, but they're a low profit business. And it's a result of the fact that, like, they're non-compromising on the quality of their plateware. They're non-compromising on their linen service. They're non-compromising on the toilet paper in the bathroom. Everything is non-compromisable. So even when the price goes up, it's not like they raise their menu price at that restaurant in a noticeable way. They just eat it to stay consistent. While most businesses will look for the cheaper alternative or find another way, they are non-compromising because they don't want to change a standard. And I think that is, in my realm, not that much different. Trying to do the same thing all the time, every single day, time and time again, and ensure that it doesn't take from what the guest could feel. So sometimes you do it for less in the hopes that you can do it for a long time, and the less adds up over the long term.
I want to talk about some of the kind of like super insights and tricks that you've learned to designing a restaurant. Some of the insights that I've had just being a student of hospitality like you is, Soho House and Cicconi's, they kind of always design their restaurants around the bar. Like, the bar is kind of always in the middle. Houston's has a very programmatic layout. St. Ambrose, another one, has a very systematic layout of how they set up the restaurant, the front bar, and how everything looks. What have you found to be these little secrets that, regardless of the concept, like, the nuts and bolts are done this way? Maybe it's lighting and sound. Who knows? What are your little things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's probably a small handful of them that maybe are specific to me. And the ones that you mentioned, I think, are pretty industry kind of understood. I think the magic is also sitting in every seat that you can in the restaurant during the design process. And I don't mean physically saying, oh, this chair is good or bad. That's, obligatory. But how is that table over there feel about this restaurant? Yes, the bar is centralized, but this table so far from the bar, that what are they feeling? Today's viewpoint on how I see renders and everything else is I can have render modeling from every chair in the restaurant. So I can see, what am I looking at? Like, this feels like it's on the way to the bathroom. Is it not? I feel like this is a dead zone in the restaurant. Is it not? I think a lot of sometimes you find interior designers too, when you collaborate, who design for magazine, they design for pictures, they design for the first day, but they have no comprehension of, like, materiality and functionality. And yeah, it's hospitality graded or it's commercially graded, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not going to spend an arm and a leg to try to maintain what looks good on day one. So I would say, first and foremost for me, understanding every seat in the restaurant. I'd rather have less chairs that are all great than more chairs and some not be great. And so I think a lot of people like build how many seats do you have? Like, every landlord says, well, how many chairs do you have? Does it matter? If they're not full, then who cares? It means nothing. The relationship to that is your kitchen designed thoughtfully enough to actually allow the potential of your restaurant to transpire? Like you can tell me I have 150 seats, but my kitchen's designed that I turn this restaurant maximum twice a night, even though the concept desired to be turned 3 times a night. And that restaurant experience is not 2 hours and 20 minutes when it really should be an hour and 30. And I miss out on that last turn of the night. So I think design of kitchen in correlation to the capacity of the restaurant. Also, I think, and this is, I mean, I could go on for days on this topic, but like, is your kitchen designed for labor efficiency? More people doesn't necessarily mean more profit in this realm because I can't put out more food. It's just more labor, more space. So, like, can I make the smallest environment to maximize the greatest return while also still putting out highest quality product? And I think that's where a lot of like, well, I designed a concept in my head, but I didn't design it clearly enough. And then when I go to translate that to the interior design architecture world, they didn't understand it. And so I got a kitchen that's not too big, or a kitchen that's too small, or a kitchen that's too big at all. And I don't have enough seats or the size of the restaurant. And to be candid, I also say this all the time, is like, the guests don't care that my mechanical system cost $1 million. They don't feel it. I mean, I'm not saying like, okay, they like the air conditioning in the room is great, but like in their mind, good for you, but not good for them. They want to, they want to feel all the elements that are meaningful to them and managing those realities. And I think that's a big, real estate selectional process and lease process to work in this realm, to be like, I want to put all my money into the guest experience and not all my money into the stuff that no one could care less about. Oh, great. You have orange water line coming in. No one cares. So my viewpoint is, number one, no bad seats. The relationship between the dining room, the kitchen, and the totality of capitalization are critical. I think another one for me is your restaurant a billboard? And does that matter? There's a lot of unique, cool places that are so hidden and cryptic. And like in many markets, that's meaningful because there's so much density and absorption around you. Like, yeah, I'm happy to be the door with no name on it when I have 19 other places surrounding me. But do I want to be the door with no name on it when no one else is here and I have no billboard? So like, does your real estate choice represent a billboard or a landmark for the restaurant in a way that helps tell the story before anyone even walked in? I think part of it is like, are you in the hearts and minds of your guests? That's where social media to me is relevant. Like, am I in the heart and mind of the guest, even when they're not hungry? The design opportunity of a restaurant can lend that as well. And I also think there's a piece to me that is understanding of how does it feel at every meal period, which is also really hard because a lot of interior designers design in their mind at like 8 o'clock on a Saturday night and what it feels like. But I'm like, what does it feel like on a Tuesday at 5 PM when Grammy wants to come eat and there's no one else in the building? Like, do you think about the immersive thought of how your restaurant feels at all times of the day? And are you in a great position to design for Tuesday as you are to design on Saturday as a guest and as a designer and as an operator? So there's so many, and I think that's the magic, reality of this business, for good and bad. It's like, I tell my dad all the time, he's in multifamily space. I'm like, you take a rent, you sign a lease, it's a 1-year deal. Someone's window's drafty. You have 11 and a half months to fix it. If it's drafty in my dining room, I have 11 seconds to fix it. And if I don't fix it in those 11 seconds, the sensation and feeling for that whole moment is gone. And it carries on with the guest. I was drafty, like if short-term memory is sensationalized right now. But in the apartment business, like you fix it a week later and like, oh, by the time the lease renewal shows up and there's a 5% rent bump, like no one's really thinking about the drafty window. In my world, it's like, I'm only surviving if you're telling people how good it was, not just showing up. You got to tell people how great it was. And so I think about every design element that doesn't give me the chance to marginalize that spread. And I think that's the difference. That's why it's expensive to build restaurants today, build great ones, because you have to build in all of those realities to minimize those problems. And there's so much that can go wrong. And there's so many moving parts in that hour and a half that you're in the building that you got to spend the dollars to marginalize those heartburns at every wake and turn.
How do you create a vibe in the restaurants? Because you could have the best food, you could have beautiful design, but if the vibe sucks, if there's low energy, people probably aren't coming back. Like, how have you kind of cracked that?
So I think the magic element to vibe that, often gets forgotten and often maybe gets overlooked, it's people are the vibe. Find me an amazing restaurant on the planet that's empty and it has no vibe. And take me to the shittiest place on the planet and pack it full of people and it has a vibe. And so a lot of vibe comes down to whether or not the marketing is met with the operational excellence. I can market all I want. You've seen it down in South Florida. There's a necessary amount of like smoke and mirrors marketing that happens in that market. And it might vibe for a visit or two or a month or three, but there's not enough money to keep up with that game unless people are actually transacting. And I don't mean coming in there for a drink and an appetizer. I mean like going in and transacting. And a lot of that comes down to the operation just falling short. And so if the operation falls short, then I don't care what I'm telling you at a marketability level, there is no marketing. Like I can only give you Mickey Mouse reality for so long until you're like, this is not real stuff. And I think social media also accelerates that because what happens with social is like, I want to show you a full dining room. But when Lucy shows up with her video camera and she's there at 5:00 and she's showing you an empty dining room, I can't stop her. So the messagings are all over the place. And so I would tell you the vibe to me starts with people and how your venue is designed, operated, and marketed to allow the people side. And I think that's a result of a product market fit conversation too. It's like, do you want to build a 400 unit community or a 400 seat restaurant in a market that doesn't really want an 80 seat restaurant? Build them a 65 seat restaurant, even though the market can afford 80 seats. Because the fact of the matter is I'd rather produce a sensation of I can't get in versus there's always a table available. And even if there is a table available, did that even evaluate whether or not every seat in this room is great, even when the room is half full? So people play a huge role. I think also in addition to that, like how immersive your concept is truly something I think people can identify when they're there. Is the music available or is it curated, thoughtful, intentional, meaningful? And I don't just mean music. How far did you go to understand the value of sound? Low frequency, mid frequency, high frequency, sound absorption, sound isolation. I feel the bass, but I'm not annoyed by the bass. The horns and the speakers are not screaming at me. I'm sitting down talking to Jake. I feel the music, but I don't have to talk through the music. Those are all meaningful attributes. And a lot of that is planning, processing, relationships, and who you choose to do work with. And that's just music. I got lighting. I could keep going. How are we affecting sunlight in this room? When natural light's in this room, does it affect us positively or negatively? Solar gain. I mean, there's a litany of things. And I think the best restaurants, the best people in hospitality are so obsessed in how you feel that they think about how you feel before you ever feel it. So I'm thinking about how I have Southern exposure in this room and like, what am I doing to make sure that when you sit at this table, it's nothing short of extraordinary. If I don't think of that, you're going to melt in this building and you're never going to come back. Or you're going to be too hot eating this hot food. You're going to wish we didn't serve this food to you. So I think the sensations of feeling go back to vibe. Like where speaker placement is, as I mentioned that to you, is also important. Because like, where do I want you to gather and congregate? If you feel like the energy is all in the bar, then why would you want to sit at the table? Then I'm never going to fill the tables. I only fill the bar. And that restaurant might as well be half the size. So my takeaway is producing that is really immersively thinking about how people feel and then met with the size of the target market realities and then all those little details that add up. Lighting, tone. I personally despise direct lighting in a restaurant setting. Like I want the light where I need it, but I don't want to see it. I want it on my table, but I don't want too much of it on my table. I want to feel the lighting. I don't want to see the lighting. I want to enjoy the jewelry of the glow, but I don't want to be like, why is this light in my face? Or how come I see too much of that guest across the table from me who I don't control how well they're dressed or what they make you feel. So I don't want to show you too much of that guest if I can avoid it. And all that to me adds up in how people feel about a particular restaurant and vibe. And there's a lot of that. There's your choice of what's on the menu, how big your portions are. dictate, lots of things that I would say, all compound back to, well, what's the place's vibe?
Have you ever had to pivot a restaurant or close a venue because something didn't work? And if you had, like, what would you boil that experience down to? What was the biggest mistake you learned from?
It's a great question. I've never closed a restaurant, and I should say that differently, but in my experience so far, and I mentioned this earlier about like what I opened in 2011 at 24, 25 years old to what's open today, I would be lying to you if I told you they were the same exact thing. And it's, I think, a result of the fact that, like, more importantly than anything, I told you, like, what motivates me about owning those restaurants is the places that inspire me to want to dine dictate a lot of it. And, my taste change, my energy for what a product might be has evolved. I would tell you that, like, and not to spend more time on this topic than I want to, but COVID changed a lot, especially in my market. We closed and then it opened and then got closed again governmentally for another 6 months. I had a lot of my restaurants in downtown Detroit where it's, high suburban sprawl to support office density that changed to work remote. And before you know it, majority of the white collar jobs that were in that market or sitting at home at their pool or backyard or God knows where and shifted to other markets. And you have to shift. You got to evolve. You have to change. I chose to make a shift on a restaurant of mine that was probably the most profitable restaurant that I had ever built. And I felt the market wasn't there anymore. COVID, like, that restaurant was a high volume 50-50 reservation to walk-in traffic. It was doing 6,000 plus guests a week. So it was a very high traffic restaurant. And I felt very confidently that there was not that size of the market going to be back post-COVID. I'm not wrong. I was very right about it. But what I shifted it to was something that I wanted to dine at. And what I realized was, and this was probably the biggest business mistake I think I've made. It's not a mistake. It's just been a harder struggle, which is like any business. Had I changed the name of that restaurant, I'd have a new line out the block. But I didn't change the name of that restaurant, and I evolved the principles of that restaurant. And the reality is, if you were a loving fan of what it was, you now felt I took something from you that you loved. If you were not a loving fan of that restaurant, there's no second shot because it's not your loving call. And so the grind that it's been to tell you, and I use this as a great example. If someone said my name to you in the street, you'd have an opinion about it, whatever it might be. How hard would it be for that opinion to change without you ever actually going? It would take a lot of other people's opinions. That's the reality of what I experienced. Was like, man, where did all these people go? Well, I can tell you they're not in their office, but it's not like I got a great second shot at getting them to enjoy this brand at first. So I've spent a lot of time since then, from 2021. So it's been like a 4-year constant tweak and grind on that project to get it to be to a point today where people are excited about what we're offering there. Because it took a long time, even in a smaller market, for them to be like, wait, there's something new there. Oh, when I walk in and I'm like, man, they remodeled this place and spent millions of dollars. It looks nothing like I remember it. Yeah, I needed you to know that 4 years ago, but it takes time to foster and change people's opinions. And in this business, it's like the only, gasoline to that fire is how many Jake Wurzaks want to walk out of there and tell everybody. Because if you don't, the progress is a slow maneuver, because everybody will chase what's new, shiny, and bright for at least a little while. Had I just changed the name, I would have struck a match on that brand that would have otherwise given it a spark that I had a low, slimmering flame for a lot longer than I had hoped. That was probably the biggest, like, business maneuver shift. I've opened a concept before, which was really, it was unique. It was called Cash Only Supper. It was called Cash Only. Originally, it was built beneath Prime and Proper, and it was built to be a nightclub. And we ran great nightclub business for probably 3+ years. COVID showed up, put a pause on nightclub in a dramatic way. And then we had an incident in that club where, long story short, a gentleman attacked our security guard and actions transpired. And I was like, you know what? It wasn't that event that caused me to close it. It was just like, I didn't want anything to take energy away from Prime and Proper. It wasn't that that place didn't make sense, and it would have continued to make sense, I think, even till this day. But I made the decision that, like, you know, you are who your friends are. And if that room wasn't going to cultivate the right type of audience for the well-being of the restaurant attached to it, and you have to walk through Prime Proper to get to cash only, I was like, it's time to evolve. I evolved it into a supper club, which, you know, reality was like, if that thing was in Miami, it would have been an absolute gold mine. Like live music, five-person bands, dinner theater. It was like the Copacabana of Goodfellas. Like it was really like those places that like I desired and dreamed about if I was my grandparents, where I'd want to go. And I just realized the market wasn't big enough in Michigan to service it. Truly speaking, it was like I probably could have just ran that place as a private events club from the beginning and it would have soared, which is what it is today. And we sell it for multiple private events a week now. But you know, that those were the examples of things that maybe like didn't pan out as well as maybe I thought they would. When I look back, a lot of them, I may have also ran to what I wanted on those particular projects more than I did a lot of the R&D DNA that I described at Prime and Proper. So like, you know, and I think that's the piece of hospitality that I take away. Pivoting at the hip in hospitality is never the right move, because your feelings are short-term emotional versus long-term gratifying. Like what do I want right now? Like, it's no different than saying like, don't go to the grocery store hungry. This is the same way in hospitality that I'm like, don't pivot in hospitality to what you think you want in this particular moment. Really cook down that sauce to make sure that's what is critical. Like, you know, these old cooking analogies, like, you know, reduce that sauce down to really understand like, whether or not it's thick for the long term versus, man, super tasty in the moment. Because those super tasty ones, they won't last. And I think that's another piece when you I use our Hillstone analogy. They're not a trend centric restaurant. By the time they pick up something that's new, that thing has trended itself out, you know, beyond the cows coming home. But for them, they don't do it as a trend. They're like, nope, we want to serve artichokes, and we're going to serve it for 20 years, and no one's going to keep serving artichokes, but we'll keep serving them. They're not a trend setter. They just execute at a high level. So I think that's a long-term reductional thing that when I look at those other projects, had I spent a little more time, I would have changed the name of Townhouse. I would have done it. But, you know, I didn't want to change the name of Townhouse because in my head, I was like, well, that's like it failing. But it didn't fail. It was just like the market changed, and I knew the market was changing because I was in the market every day. And the world didn't know the market changing, but I knew, and I didn't want, you know, to let go of something that was doing $10 million a year and printing money that for me, you know, at that point in time would have maybe felt like failure.
I have a similar thing going on. I may call you offline to have you double click and workshop something with me, because that was a real powerful takeaway. And we're considering pivoting a restaurant concept. And I think changing the name is
mandatory.
Very key insight. Yeah.
Oh, 100%. I mean, a lot of people's perception of things are like, name somebody on the planet, you have an opinion. And like your restaurant, if you weren't in the seat you're sitting in, you wouldn't be worried about its name. Like you're in the seat thinking about it because the fostered opinions exist. Change their opinion of it. Give them the narrative that there's something new and exciting coming. And that's not, oh, we changed the menu. Like, because I think most people make the decision in restaurants in the long term on trust. You pick the same places you like to go. I'd imagine there's a routine restaurant in your realm that it's a trusting choice. You could argue, you might even say they don't actually have the best so-and-so or so-and-so, but all of the other trusting variables check the box for you. They know who you are when you walk in. They know your kids' names. They'll manage the fact that your kids might make a mess at the table. Don't care. Trust. So like what that restaurant doesn't probably have is it doesn't have a fostered deep enough sensation of trust, whether it's in the food, whether it's in the service, whether it's in the hospitality, whether it's in the human capital in the building. Like there's just missing areas of trust or product market fit, or I should say, like you're trying to serve caviar to an audience that wants fish and chips. Like you're going to eventually miss like, and I think that's also accepting of like, well, I have this X amount of, I have this product that's like this. Well, what's the food juxtaposition to that product? It doesn't always mean that food element's the product market fit. Because a lot of people who are in this arena, they actually want this elsewhere. Like the most, maybe the most wealthy geographical area in my suburban market is the restaurant that nice restaurants generally do the worst. If you take that nice restaurant 5 miles out of the way, putting my sport coat on to go eat there is not an annoyance. But if I got to put my sport coat and button on down to go to a restaurant that's 1 minute from my house, and I got to get back in the car and drive home and talk to my wife for nothing for 1 minute, I'm dressed up. I'm like, why is this here? I don't want to go there. So the convenient choice and the experiential choice sometimes are very different choices.
I want to talk about your growth and your expansion, because when you get to your level of success and experience in the beginning, no one's calling you and no one's really helping you. But now I assume people are calling you, and people that own real estate are calling you because they want you to make their real estate better by putting a restaurant inside of their building. What does your expansion to new markets and new spaces look like today? Are you doing those yourself with your own capital, or are you looking to have someone else pay for everything and you'll do it as a management deal or something different? What's your strategy and mindset on that?
Yeah, so my restaurants have all looked the same thus far, just kind of packaged in some variable differences. But the biggest one is I have no outside partners in any of my projects, and I never borrowed any money to do this. So, like, very different than a general real estate type business that requires lots of debt service. My approach was go into my deal, pay my parents back for the amount of money I couldn't afford to finish my first restaurant. I think I paid them in 63 days or something ridiculous. I just went to the cash register, and every day it was like, I paid you off. Today, I just foster that with the proceeds that the business presents itself. And I have tried to grow on the basis of that. Now I'm at the point where my growth interest probably exceeds my immediate comfort in cash flow. So, my conversations today are in the, very aggressive debt strategies with, institutionalized partners that exist, regional banks, local banks, national banks, or, going back to the same till that I went to the first time and saying, if I'm going to borrow the money from this guy for X, I'd rather borrow it from you for Y. I'm paying you. You know my business better than they know it, and your tolerance for my business a lot better than theirs anyway. So I'm back at that game, but my track record's longer and the association of risk looks a bit different. For where I'm at today, like most of these projects look sometimes the same in some respects, because I've always tried to approach the project, which has been one of my pluses in the world of restaurants. And you can understand this from being a landlord, is like, I go to the landlord with a demand for the cheapest rent without their money. Because I know at the end of the day, that's my best equation to the most attractive deal. I actually now try to find landlords that tried positioning their real estate to think that they're trying to acquire a hospitality or restaurant tenant. So they do a lot of shit up front on a bigger scale, a bigger project. We planned for a restaurant. We put in black steel for a restaurant. Like you were doing that for me and anyone else. I don't want the credit for it. And neither, I want the most attractive rent deals, generally how I look at deals, because I'm not working on fees. I don't work on other people's slow return of capital. I look at P&L profitability, saying how much profit's coming back to dictate what I can do next. And is there enough profit to come back to pay off what I'm generally doing? Where it's shifted today is, and as projects have become more expensive, I'm also looking at like where in that project flow as I leave my market and the availability of my immediate, Metro Detroit, downtown suburban Detroit market, where I choose to go and like what attributes exist. So like, I would be lying to you to tell you that I haven't studied immensely, probably 8 out of 10 projects being generational two. A lot of people made bad mistakes over the last few years. And I feel like some of them are not even recognizable that there was even a restaurant there for most people. Obviously, I'm not going to carry their brand. And if they didn't do enough damage, and I don't mean physically, but like even out in the public's viewpoint of their product, could I come in and say, you know what, there's a great project. So the Nashville project was unique for us. It's in the Grand Hyatt that just opened. There's a hotel developer called Southwest Value Partners, who's the developer on that. They put in a restaurant for a well-known chef named Sean Brock, who opened a restaurant called the Continental with them 2 years ago. They built a very expensive restaurant. And, I think a combination of relationship between him and ownership and product market fit and how I viewed the marketing strategy of that restaurant, I felt like those were characteristics that I'm like, the market doesn't have a real opinion about if I change their opinion about it. Obviously, I'm changing the name of the brand and I'm going to ride out on a brand that has a story and a history and, try to attribute that from marketability perspective as much as I could or can, but it's a generational too. Like we're going to spend half of what we would have spent to build out a restaurant. To go into a new market and do that was important to me because the risk of going to market needs to be spent on PR and other marketing dollars, not, like I mentioned earlier, mechanical systems and plumbing lines and grease traps that nobody knows that they exist anyway. So that was a characteristic that I looked at as I moved to grow and expand. Another piece is I took on a project at what would be the equivalent of like the Midwest version of Bell Harbor Shops with the Forbes company at Somerset Collection here in Michigan. And every one of my neighbors in that brand are LVMH and Gucci and these families of business. I'm the only real restaurant experience at the entire side of the shopping collection that represents the super premium. And then there's this beautiful walkway and you cross over and it's the Apples of the world and the Tesla stores and the whatever else. So I felt like, okay, can I reimagine how people view hospitality, food service in a mall environment and not be the next mall restaurant? And I viewed that in a sense, like I want people to come here, not because it's a mall or not because it's proximity of LVMH brands or Louis or this one or that one, but understand that we can communicate hospitality as a fashion brand. So our brand is designed to feel like a fashion brand. It's talk like a fashion brand, walk like a fashion brand, have similar things that you'd expect from a fashion brand, like seasonal collections and uniform elements that change, like a fashion drop would in series between fall of 26 and winter of 27, like that sensation. Because I found there's like this continual ethos between food and seasonality and the relationships of how I might make you feel, the same way fashion brands do that with apparel and clothing and collections. So like, could we tie those conversations into a unique brand? So I spent 2 years on that brand identity that will start construction here next month. But that brand's unique for us. And that project's unique because it's at a mall and like has an interest in changing people's perceptions on that mall in a way that I think we can foster that and then hopefully tell that story as we look to move that brand. Like I want to go wherever Christian Dior and Louis Vuitton feel like they belong because I belong in those proximities, and landlords and developers alike say, these guys clearly have understood how to communicate like a fashion conversation and walking into their space. And that's like house food package and what's it look like to go and table arrangements and tapestries and upholsteries and pillows and all these little accessories feel like you're in a fashion house. And so that's kind of, looking at how these deals are fostered. It's like, they're not just fostered on, rent versus TI and cam charges and whatever. I mean, if you look under the hood, a lot of my success has been because I have been very intentional. I think a lot of that was a result of how I grew up, in the light of my dad in real estate. And that I always approached these deals like I didn't need the landlord's money. And so my rents were always more lucrative. And then I bet on myself. My average rent cost in my restaurants there under 2% of top line. And that includes pass-throughs as well. So like our rent is a very low factor, which leads to more profit. which leads to, well, I don't need your TI, so I don't want your percentage rent conversation in the conversation. Okay, well, you didn't take our money, so I guess I shouldn't ask for percentage rent. Well, for the next 25 years operating in this space, that's a lot of money back to me in lieu of the couple $100,000 or more of what the money meant up front. And I think that that's just the kind of things when I look at a landlord, I'm like, if you're not signing up with a tenant who is willing to put all the chips on the table that they have for themselves, the likelihood that the outcome is great is probably not that great.
Jeremy, I asked all the guests on the podcast the same closing question, and that's, what's your favorite hotel?
Ooh, my favorite hotel. Well, there's a hotel that's been on my radar for a minute, and I haven't been there yet, but I'm going there this summer. So I'm super intrigued to see if it, like, all the things about this hotel reference what I love about it. And it's this hotel by a famous chef in Israel, and it's called R48. It's on Rothschild Street, and I'll send you the details. But it's an all glass box in this downtown core, and like food in Tel Aviv. Yep. And food is the premise. My earphones feel like they might die on me in a moment, so I'll try to get this out. But food is the premise of that entire experience, and hospitality resonates. So it's like 24-hour food is a culture in a place that's only got 10 rooms. So like for a place I haven't been, like that just like feels like the kind of hotel I aspire to feel like I would be part of. My next favorite hotel that I've stayed at, I would say probably some of these smaller hotels in Japan that I've dined at and been a guest at, that I don't know, just felt like I was born onto another planet when I was there. Kyoto in particular, Osaka, there was another one. The specific of the Kaiseki that I stayed at, which had a hotel and lodging, I don't remember the name at the moment, but in Tokyo, that for me was probably the most immersive sensation of a hotel. Like I just felt that hospitality was on its greatest platform there. And obviously, I think culturally they do an amazing job making you feel a particular way. But I think staying in a hotel is also, if anybody who's in my arena, who's very serious about this arena, always feels like the stone you expect to hopefully step up to getting to. Because I'm like, oh, I get you for 2 or 3 hours. I'm like, imagine if I could have you for several days, and how great that could be if I was able to curate for those many hours and days. And I think that that's what's, remarkable about hospitality and hotels for sure.
Thanks for coming on the podcast, man. I love it. We get to talk for hours. Hey, everyone. It's Jake here. Thanks again for joining me on this conversation. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Lastly, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Jake Wurzak. I'll see you in the next episode.
Jake Wurzak is the founder and CEO of Dove Hill Capital Management. All opinions expressed by Jake and his guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Dove Hill Capital Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not reflect or represent real estate, financial, or investment advice.